Great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am so glad that I'm actually here because I had to change my flight because the flight that was originally scheduled did not leave until that flight is probably landing about right now. Is what's happening with that flight. So I am glad to be here, and it's a privilege to be with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a courageous public witness. Probably all of you could give me many reasons why we're in a time where we particularly need a courageous public witness. So I feel like saying, okay, pause and think for a moment about why we need those. I won't because I'm going to run out of time if I do. So I'm just going to assume that they're front of mind. To talk about a courageous public witness, I've learned not to make the assumption that everybody even knows why Christians ought to have a public witness. Because I hang around with people that are always talking about faith and public life, I start to think that everybody has thought about why you do it. And what I've found a lot of times is that sometimes people have theological reasons for doing it. Other times, it really is essentially just a spiritual intuition that they have. Well, I see that there's a problem. I care about that problem. Maybe I should be involved in helping to do something about that problem. But if you ask them to explain to you why a Christian should be doing that, why is it that what Christians believe compels you to do that? I've discovered that, one, there are a range of ways people would answer that, but second, a lot of times people don't have much more than the spiritual intuition type of answer. I'm glad if that's all someone has, honestly, because a lot of Christians don't even have that, I fear. They really have a kind of ad hoc approach to their public engagement, if they have that public engagement at all. So I want to talk about a basis for a public witness for a little bit before talking specifically about that witness being courageous, and then at the end talking about something that's connected to what David talked about, and that is the courage we need to really address the question of race. So, this conference is a Matthew 25 conference. Matthew 25 is actually a pretty good rationale itself for being involved in a public witness. What kind of public witness is that? One where one says, well, at the end of the day, I'd rather be with the sheep than with the goats. So, what does it mean to be a sheep according to Matthew 25? So there are certain works there. You visit the sick, you attend to the poor, you visit people in jail, these kinds of things. So that's a kind of end of the story, final judgment motivation for being involved in works of service, for being involved in public life. That's a good one. There's also a view we can have from the front end of the story as well as the back end of the story. So I want to talk a little bit about the front end of the story. And talking about the front end of the story, I want to talk about what I and some others call the first Great Commission. If I say Great Commission, you think, Acts 1:8 or Matthew 28. Yes, great commissions indeed, spreading the gospel around the globe. I think that's a great thing, a great task. But there is a first Great Commission on page 1, or that I sometimes call the either undiscovered Great Commission or the neglected Great Commission or just the forgotten Great Commission. So I want to make sure that we know what it is. So in Genesis 1:26, when God says he's going to create human beings, and he describes the function of human beings, he says that they are going to be the rulers over creation. Right? And then he creates them, verse 27, verse 28, then he blesses them, and then he pronounces to them this, what some of us call the creation mandate, some call it the cultural mandate. I'm not going to quibble about that. If you'd like to quibble, that's cool, but let's not do that. but that mandate at the beginning where he says, rule over my creation. Now, that ruling over the creation is a pretty big task, I think. The entire created order is the responsibility of divine image bearers. Now, why am I calling this a first Great Commission? It's a first Great Commission because it has to do with every area of life in that creation. It's not just about agriculture. It might be easy to think that, well, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, things along the land. I mean, it kind of sounds like farming, animal husbandry, something like that. So yes, but really, rule over the creation. And to rule over the creation is essentially really to be a steward over the creation. Now, the way that some people read the Bible, they might say to me, well, the word rule is there, or the word dominion is there, Vince. I don't see the word stewardship there. You're right, you don't. However, let me give you a question, which is, how do you assess how a ruler does their job? And how that ruler does their job when this ruler was given their rulership responsibility from God, whose creation it is. And if it's God's creation and he gives other people the rulership responsibility, they have responsibility for something that isn't theirs. It belongs to another. What's stewardship? Stewardship is when you have the responsibility given to you for something that belongs to someone else, but it's on you. And you will be the one who is assessed about how well you do with it. So when humans are given the responsibility to rule over God's creation, they are given a gigantic stewardship task. So what are you going to do with God's world? And when we think about everything that's involved with God's world, you can't avoid things like politics, culture, law, all the ministries that you're doing here. All of those things are dimensions of that stewardship task. Now, I sometimes feel like, even though this is an audience of the convinced, you might know people who are not the convinced. And some of the not convinced might say, if you sort of tell them what I just said, they'll go, you love page 1, but you don't think about page 3. Because you know what happens on page 3, don't you? The fall happens on page 3. And when the fall happens on page 3, doesn't that mean that your first Great Commission, your stewardship responsibility becomes an exercise in futility? To which I say, read more closely, I say. Because, yes, sin enters. Yes, there's a curse. Let's think about what God says in that curse. Isn't it interesting that when God talks about childbirth, he doesn't say, no more childbirth. He just said, childbirth. Oh, that's going to be rough. It's going to get harder. But guess what? Children will be born. And then when he talks to the man about his labor, he doesn't say, actually, good luck. Because, whatever kind of agriculture you're doing, weeds 100% of the time. That's not what he says. He says you will get fruit from the ground. It's going to be a whole lot harder, and you won't only get fruitfulness from the ground. So what the curse introduces is complication into the first Great Commission, not an erasure of the first Great Commission. And I think a lot of times people think, well, the fall happened, so guess what? When they left the garden, God said, bye, run for your life, and one day I will send you a Savior. But meanwhile, just run, kind of act crazy, and anything that you do, you know that it's all about futility. That's not what he says. So yes, they go out, it's hard, it's complicated, but the first Great Commission is never dismissed. It has always been there. It absolutely remains. Okay? And it's not, by the way, in competition with the second Great Commission, the one that we usually think about. What happens there, I think, is an interesting thing, which is we have this first Great Commission, the curse happens, people think sometimes, so what did Jesus come to do? Well, because everything was really an exercise of futility, and it was really like a black hole, basically, Jesus was coming to just rescue us and take us out of all of that. But that is not the case. Actually, what Jesus is doing is he's reclaiming that creation. Okay? So if you want to call it a rescue, it's not a rescue out of the creation. It's a rescue into that creation and reclaiming it. And what that means is that the people who are part of that being reclaimed, their participation in that ought to reflect then a better way of living out that Great Commission, rather than thinking that if I'm saved, I don't want to be worldly, and therefore not to be worldly means to do what? Well, don't care too much about politics. Don't care too much about culture. Don't care too much about law, medicine, social work, all these things. Let other people really invest in those, but be very good at handing tracts out to people so that they are introduced to Jesus. Now, please understand, folks, I'm not saying in a church of all places, I'm not coming in your church doing this. I'm not coming in this church and saying, now, evangelism, please. Who needs to do evangelism? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the first commissions are together, okay? And that these people that you evangelize who get saved are human beings that are being made alive by the Spirit and now being able to live more like God wanted humans to live in the first place. And if they're living like humans in the first place, then what that means is now they really should be more engaged in the politics, in the law, in the medicine, etc. Instead of saying that other people do it because it's too worldly. Well, let's talk about being worldly. The problem with worldliness isn't that you care about God's world. It's that you care wrongly about God's world. 1 John 2, 15 to 17, do not love the world. Yes. Everything in the world. Let's see what that is. Okay, 3 things. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life. Isn't it interesting that none of those have anything to do with the actual stuff of creation itself? And that they are all about misdirected commitments or desires in the created order rather than participation in the created order per se. So the problem with worldliness is that you've got an allegiance problem in the world that God has made. And your allegiance is to something other than God in your participation in those things in the world. So if your politics, your participation in culture, participation in medicine, law, social work, if you take your cues from someone other than God for your participation in it, then yes, you're worldly. But if you're trying to do it in what I like to call being a rehumanized kind of way, then you're actually participating properly in those things as someone that belongs to God. And what we need to recognize, I believe, is that why is this conference important and conferences like it? Because God's wanted his people to be about the business of doing this all along. And being introduced to Jesus means now you really need to be doing it. And now you can do it with the right motives, with the right allegiance. And you're not in some competition with salvation. Because think about this. Once a person is converted, then what are they supposed to do with most of their hours of the week? Because the fact of the matter is, friends, most people can't stand on corners handing out tracts. Most people in their jobs can't do evangelistic invitations 8 hours a day. So what are they going to do with all that stuff? How are they going to go about all that stuff? Are they going to shelve being Christian while they're doing all that stuff? Or are they going to bring being Christian to all those things? Sometimes the reason why we complain about things, right? You know why? It's because Christians have said to people about all this other stuff, everybody else, you do them, we'll ignore God's creation and just make sure people have the right thing when they die. But I think what God's wanted all along is for his people who are part of his process of reclaiming this world, wants his people to live rightly in the world. Yes, it means introducing people to Jesus, but it certainly means living as humans ought to in this world. Now, I think that is fundamentally important. And for that to be important, we need to have an elevated theology of creation, and we need to have a view of redemption that's not antagonistic to creation. I mean, think about this. If you're feeling nervous about me giving too much attention to creation, elevating it, all I want to ask you is, do you celebrate Easter? Do you celebrate Christmas? Because if you celebrate Christmas, you celebrate Jesus taking on flesh. If you celebrate Easter, you celebrate Jesus being raised in a body, not as a sophisticated hologram. Right? You remember when he said to Thomas, he didn't say, okay, guys, look, Thomas is going to come over, and I just love jokes. So, you all know I'm nothing but a hologram to begin with, so I'm going to tell him to touch me. And when I tell him to touch me, I mean, you all know it's just going to be spectacular. He's going to try to touch me, and it's going to be whoosh. Right? But of course, that's not what happens. If you celebrate Christmas and Easter, you believe that the eternal Son took on flesh that you can touch. He's human. Humans, the crown of creation. If he takes that on, how can redemption ever be antagonistic to creation? Now, if you're a Gnostic and you hate creation, awesome. Actually, not awesome, heretical. But the point is, if you celebrate Christmas and Easter and you mean it, then you believe that to be Christian is for God to be reclaiming his world. And for God to be saying all over again, like he said in Genesis 1:31, this creation is indeed very good. And very good in the cultural superlatives means whatever your ultimate superlative is. Okay, because you say very good these days, people are like, oh, not so good. Right? Very good means excellent, awesome, sweet, sick, whatever it is. Okay, whatever your go-to superlative is, that's what Genesis 1:31 means. And the incarnation means that God is saying, you better believe I meant it when I said it. And if that's what God says, right, and he says, humans, you have the privilege and awesome opportunity to participate in my world as stewards of my creation, showing people how to live well in this world, attending to the problems of this world. That's an amazing thing if we do that. So we need to understand a basis for this. Last thing to say about this before I talk about some dimensions of courage, and that is this. It's really important that when we're participating in the world, okay, that we seek transformation without triumphalism. Okay? You absolutely need to seek transformation, but don't put the weight on yourself to think that at the end of the day, whatever I'm doing for transformation, this must be absolutely the way it's going to be in the realized kingdom of God. Okay, that's called chasing a realized eschatology. Eschatology in the story, everything gets wrapped up, shalom at the end, right, that kind of thing. So, no. What it means is what we're doing in our pursuit of transformation is at the least making gestures of what kingdom reality is. But things that always have a sign on it that says, subject to revision and refinement. So that we do it with enthusiasm, but with humility, and always ready to say, let's go back to the drawing board. Instead of saying, this is, of course, if anyone had a brain, I mean, they would know that this is the way to do it for everyone. No, that's called triumphalism, where you're sure you know how to do it for everybody. No, that's not the way to do it. We need to just keep striving, trying, throwing things at a wall, throw something else at a wall, and we just keep at it. Gesturing. And some gestures become more than gestures. And some it's like, well, we tried that, and then we tried something else. And that's all right. Keep gesturing, seeking the transformation, and remembering that the triumph doesn't come till Jesus is the one who shows up and brings the triumph. In the meantime, we keep participating, gesturing, seeking transformation, not putting the burden of triumphalism on ourselves. It's very important. So now, with that backdrop, here's a couple of things I want to note about a courageous witness. So if we're participating in this world, in this first Great Commission, I think it's important to note that for a courageous witness, to me, one of the most important things for having a witness of public engagement that's courageous is that we have to have a clear commitment that God is first over everything else. Absolute fidelity to God, and everything else is relativized. Nothing else can be in the place of God. Why is that important? Because it can be easy to think that the latest trend, the latest book you read that was really good, probably great, okay, that if I do things this way, I mean, this is the thing, and you get enthusiasm about it, and you're so committed to that you may inadvertently have your allegiance, which may be rooted in a commitment to God, but you're kind of making the first thing this other thing that you're getting caught up in. And the point isn't that that thing is a bad thing. The point is that the bad thing's not God. Because if God alone is God, then here's what God must be able to do, if we're going to be serious about this. God must always be able to interrogate our commitments about everything. Everything. Now, here's one of the reasons why I think this is really important now. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Michael Weir goes to this church, right? So Michael's a friend of mine. We've had him meeting a couple of times. And maybe some of you have heard Michael talk about the fact that we are in an era now when it comes to our politics, that for a lot of people, political commitments are operating like religious commitments for them. So here's what that means. Here's another translation of that. That means people's politics are like they're involved in a political cult. Okay? Where, if you're part of a political cult, and by the way, political cults are equal opportunity across the spectrum. Okay, so I'm not talking about whether it's just Republicans or Democrats or libertarians or actual socialists rather than supposed socialists who are really Democrats, okay? So actual socialists, et cetera, okay? Whatever those things are, all of them can be cultic. And when they're cults, one, your leaders, no matter how crazy they act, no matter what mistakes they've made, no matter what they do wrong, you can always explain it away. And they never really do wrong. There's always, yeah, but, or yeah, but they're not them, et cetera, et cetera. So your leader can never do wrong. So you always protect the leader. And number two, you are so convinced when you're in the cult of the worldview of the cult that you think you have a justified disposition towards people who aren't in your cult, a disposition of disdain and perhaps hatred toward those people. And you can say all kinds of dehumanizing things about those people because they're not in your cult. They're so stupid. They deserve to be owned. Don't you understand that? They deserve to be humiliated. And so, you have a right to dehumanize because of your commitment to the cult. The problem is that if you're in a political cult, you are an idolater. That's what you are, okay? You are an idolater. Because you're getting something that is a way of serving God in His world for how we're arranging many dimensions of public life, like why do some streets, have certain people, taking care of snow removal one way, snow roof in a different place another way. That's a political things have something to do with that. Okay, so these are important things. All right? But those things aren't God. And by the way, whatever your political commitments, okay, probably not actually talked about in the Bible. Because the Bible's not talking about a 21st century republic where you could run for office. Right? Okay? Not thinking about it. Now, I'm not saying don't do anything about it. I just said be involved in politics, among other things. Definitely be involved. I just said don't make politics everything. But it takes courage in this moment to say my commitment is to God above everything else, and I refuse to swear allegiance to cults of any kind. Because you will feel pressure connected to the concerns you have. Because there's public policy commitments associated with a lot of the things that you do, to think that I must really have my commitment to these people. You can have relative commitments to them, but not ultimate commitments to them, because no political party will save you. Okay? And political parties, if you look at the history of them, they have a strange way of morphing over time. Okay? I mean, it's just the way it goes. It's just the way it goes. So, your commitments to a morphing political reality or to the unchanging God. And to the unchanging God, by the way, who's the one that raised Jesus from the dead, not your political party. Okay? And at the end of the day, when you're standing before God, He's not going to ask you, were you a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Democratic, Socialist, Green Party, whatever. He was like, do you belong to me? And the question we must always be asking is, God, here are my commitments. How am I doing with these commitments? And here's the thing. This is why it takes courage. People get nervous if you ask them to do that. To which I want to ask them, why are you getting nervous? What is your nervous telling you? Because at the end of the day, by the way, you can say whatever you want about me, not like what I'm saying, whatever, that's fine, okay? Your problem's with God, not me. Because I'm talking about your commitment being to God alone. And if your commitment's to God alone, whatever other commitments you have are relative. So I'm not saying, therefore, don't be part of a certain political party. That's your practice of discernment. But whatever you do with that practice of discernment, however you're voting, or if you're participating within the political party machinery, which I think some Christians need to do, your participation in those things is not an act of idolatrous sacrifice. Okay? It is a way of serving God, and one of the ways of serving His world through what politics does. And politics doesn't do everything, it does some things. But God alone is first. And if your commitment is really to God, then you may be a lifelong whatever, okay? It's entirely possible that God, being the one that can interrogate your commitments, that you find yourself crossing an aisle you never thought you would cross. Now, I don't know what would make you do that or whatever. I'm just saying it's possible, because the fact of the matter is, pick your political party, okay, and you will find the misdeeds of your party. And the closer you get to the party, the more you will begin to see the dark side, whatever it is. None of which means don't be involved in politics. Part of the reason I think we have the problems we do in politics is Christians checking out of politics. Or Christians checking out of politics unless they've checked in and decided that they are going to have absolute loyalty to the party and more loyalty to the party than to God. So there are Christians, I think, who are doing that. Okay? But I don't believe that political participation means that you're always name-checking people or whatever. I do think it means that you're always asking, what's determining my priorities in this to begin with? What's helping me make my choices? What's the basis of my commitments at the absolute bottom? And am I really serving God alone? And that everything else I do is a reflection of serving God alone. I think that takes tremendous courage. I think it takes courage in any moment. I think it really takes courage now because, if you choose one side or another, everybody has very good reasons why you should be condemned. Okay? If you choose to be a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, whatever, then I hope you're able to explain how, in your fidelity to God, this is at this point why you're making these choices and have these priorities. Rather than, well, it's really because of other commitments that aren't really Christian ones why I'm doing it. I think that's a really important thing to ask. Really, really important. And if God is first, then that's a question that you can ask. It's not an easy question to ask. It's really hard. And people might get mad. People might leave. Do all those kinds of things. Yes. But if you would have courage, you will say, I remember what God says, Exodus chapter 20. Here he is saying to the Israelites, I'm the God who brought you out of Israel, out of slavery. And he says what? No gods before me. It's me, God, and you, the Israelites. No interlopers, please. No little g gods. Okay? I'm a jealous God, just us. He doesn't want anybody else. Right? And Jesus puts it positively when he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and your strength. Because if you're loving God with all you've got, there can be no idols. It takes courage to do that when there's all kinds of little g gods saying, but I've got a special offer with your name on it. Okay, and that happens all the time around all kinds of things. So I think that's one of the biggest dimensions of courage, is genuine fidelity to God alone, to God above all. Because when you do that, you will start saying things and raising questions that will not make people comfortable. But if your commitment is to God, you should ask those questions. Ask them nicely, but you should ask them. And of course, ask them of yourself. Something briefly else about courage, and then I'm going to go talk about the question of race in 14 minutes. So, David, I'm so glad that you're you've got like 2 sessions. It's great. Just David will tell you everything you need to know. Okay. So, was that too much? Okay, awesome. Good. It's important for us to have the courage to trust God more than we trust our passion for making the world better. And here's the simple reason why I say that. You can be, whatever your word is, woke, whatever, okay? You can be so committed to being whatever that is and be so committed to justice that you think it is a virtue to burn yourself out in the pursuit of that justice or passion. It takes courage to trust God alone and say, God, guess what? I need a Sabbath. I need some weeks off. I need to chill. Because all the things you're dealing with here, these are not easy things. You're on the front lines of things that are very, very hard. And sometimes people think, but it's like actually what I think a lot of Christians have acted like in the last recent years, which is like, I just feel like if I don't do something about this, I'm not sure God can do anything about it. Okay, well, yes, actually God can. Okay, because none of us is a Messiah. We worship the Messiah. So we had to set aside any messianic pretensions that we might have and recognize that we are saved by the Messiah. And that Messiah who saves us can remind us, yes, serve me, but you don't have to die in the service of me around these causes. Okay, it's one thing to be martyred, means somebody killing you. It's another thing to be actively killing yourself in the pursuit of justice or whatever it is, and then think, but I did it for Jesus. And Jesus is like, hey, I got on the cross, remember? You don't need to be on that cross. So trust God enough, have the courage to do that you'll take a time out, that you'll attend to self-care is the phrase people use, right? That you will be mindful of that. Because so many people in the pursuit of justice are strangely being destroyed by the thing they pursue. Okay? We got enough carnage without there being carnage in the pursuit of good things. All right. So, in 11 minutes, a few words about race. So here is why I decided to talk about this. Just this past weekend, a friend of mine on Twitter did a thread about African Americans being burned out in evangelicalism or wanting to make an exodus from evangelicalism. Okay, full disclosure. I'm fine, okay, personally. A. B, I don't apologize for using the word evangelical, okay? I'm not saying you got to use it. We can have that conversation. I'm fine using the word, all right? And C, I understand why people feel what they feel. But not because I have felt a lot of it myself, but because I know people who have felt a lot of things. That said, I will say one thing that I think is connected to this. So a lot of people, I'll say this one thing after I note this about the thread, sorry. See, that's what happens trying to do it in 11 minutes. So my friend in this thread just talked about, basically the same things that African Americans have talked about in evangelical or confessional Christian circles at least since the 60s. It's essentially wash, rinse, and repeat. It's just the next generation says, same thing Bill Pennell said in 1968 when he wrote My Friend the Enemy. Same thing Tom Skinner's talking about in the early 70s, when people loved it when Tom Skinner was like this black Billy Graham, till he asked questions about race. Then the money went away. Then people thought, why are you getting all political, Tom? Right? Then all of a sudden his radio program went away. Right? Same things all the time. And people go, they're just exhausted. There are people who feel like they have to commit cultural suicide to be in these settings. And they feel like, I was so excited to be around these Bible-loving people, but there was a cost I didn't know I had to pay to be there. And that cost I had to pay to be there is like dying. Okay, way before Eric Garner said, I can't breathe. Okay, there are minorities in evangelical settings saying, being in this community is an asphyxiating experience. Now, for yours truly, it's not asphyxiating. There we go. I almost feel like it's a spelling bee. I need to spell it. But asphyxiating. It's not asphyxiating for me because I'm very culturally fluid. Okay? That just happens to be, not everybody in my family's that way. I'm just one of those people, okay? I'm a cultural shapeshifter. So I'm able to be in all different kinds of spaces and to be comfortable. A lot of other people are not. It's culturally fluid. And what happens if they're not as culturally fluid as me, or they've never actually been in these predominantly white spaces that are Bible-believing spaces? They show up and they find themselves only sort of welcomed, only sort of belonging, not really in a home. And they're trying to manage being in these environments. And here's the thing you have to understand. It's not always because of direct things anybody says. It's a lot of unspoken things that happen. And they go, it's just really hard being here. Okay? And so what I'm saying to this group, all right, is at one level, you're like the convinced and converted being here. But here's the thing. Even if you're here to really contend with the question of race, probably takes more courage right now than you can imagine. Because to really deal with the question of race, you're dealing with a multifaceted phenomenon. You're dealing with people with all different kinds of experiences. I just tell you my experience. Now, here's what you have to understand. Here's my story, okay? I gave a Martin Luther King Day address in January. About a week and a half before that, there was some mail from somebody in Milwaukee. They didn't put their name on there. It was written to Professor Vincent Baycoat, Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois. I opened it up. There were 2 pieces of paper from like chapter excerpts. The first was about the intellectual inferiority of African Americans. The second was about the achievement gap between Negroes, it said, and whites, and included things about higher criminality. And included and folded in there was a newspaper clipping with my picture about my Martin Luther King Day address. Okay? That's trolling the old-fashioned way, all right? Now, I have not had lots of experiences like that. Okay? But there are a lot of people who have. And here's one of the things, right? So you know what I did? I went to I showed this to my classes. Why did I show it to my classes of mostly white people? Because generally, a lot of times what happens is, this is one of the biggest problems. The experiences of minorities are invalidated again and again and again and again. Where people say, that's not real. That didn't happen. I almost brought it with me here today. Now, if you don't believe me, I am happy to scan it, and I will send it to your email address if you think I'm lying. Okay? I mean, I don't have any reason to make up a story like that. It doesn't usually happen to me. Okay? But you should also know, those same 2 pieces of paper were sent to me probably 4 or 5 years ago, without the picture related to an address or whatever. Okay? These things happen. I don't know who this is in Milwaukee. I don't know what, he's probably in a basement somewhere doing whatever, but I don't know what's going on. But this person took the time to antagonize me. Now, I did what it's like, okay, fine. I did what I did. But, there are people who do that. And I think here's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. And I'll use a phrase that Brian Stevenson says to help us think about it. He says, people think that they've looked at the history of race. He said, we have not begun to really look at the history. And here's one of the biggest things about having courage, okay? To have the courage, more courage than you can imagine, okay, is to have the courage to absolutely look at what race has done in the modern world. You have to understand that in the creation of the modern world, with all the good things it brought, a lot of bad things too, one of the bad things it brought was the construction of the modern concept of race, which it, of course, was made by who? Europeans. And who was on top of this hierarchical conception of race? Europeans. Okay, and you got systems built around that even though certain laws got passed, think about it this way, this is 2019. 400 years ago, the first slave, and probably some indentured servants too. I know you're having a conversation about that in this state. So they came to this shore. Eventually, over time, look at a graphic online about the slave trade, and it shows all the ships over the entire slave trade. Just look up transatlantic slave trade, this real quick motion thing. It's like 3 or 4 minutes, and there are dots that represent all the ships that went from Africa to mostly to South America, actually, and then up the coast. So, since 1619, think about it this way, that's when the first slaves show up. It's 1964 and 65 when you get the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. All right? Now, how many years has it been since those laws have been passed? Okay? Not even 60. How many years has it been since the first slaves came? Over 400 this year, right? So it's at least 340 years where it's legal to oppress people on the basis of race. Now, what should your expectation be when it's been less than 60 years since laws have been passed that have made some discrimination illegal? How much do you really expect to change? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm in a church. I believe in revival, okay? I do. But when it's part of the cultural fabric to believe racial hierarchy, I mean, it's just like in the air. All right? To begin to address that, at least in the church, much less talking about public policy. I mean, it touches everything. Okay? This is an incredibly long game that has to do with an incredibly horrific history. And here's part of the reason why it requires courage. If you are in the majority culture, you actually don't have to look at the history, because nothing compels you to look at the history unless you're married to somebody who's a minority. A minority who wants to talk about those things, because there are minorities who don't, okay? Let's just talk about this. It is. I mean, people are all over the place. I mean, that's not a judgment, it's just an observation, honestly. So the point about that then is, what will compel you to even look at what you don't have to look at? Because to look at it is to look at something that is worse than whatever kind of horror movie you can imagine. And everything in you wants to say, I don't want to look. And guess what? I don't want to look either. Okay? But if the people of God are going to lead the way on race, rather than strangely formed by the culture to just go along with the status quo on race in certain ways. And this still happens in ways that are subtle and sometimes in ways that are explicit. If the church is going to lead the way towards really being people who love their neighbors as themselves and think about what does that mean in every possible dimension, right? Not from interpersonally to public policy and everything in between. To be those people, and then to say people who live together, who really know each other, who are really in each other's lives, who are really willing to deal with all of the misunderstanding and all of the emotional blow-ups that are guaranteed to happen if you deal with this. Because usually what happens is people say, yeah, I'm for it. And then what happens? They get involved. And then it's like, oh man, the temperature just went up. And then it went up even higher and higher. And you will be tempted to say, let's talk about something else. No, let's not. Because you're talking about the lives of other people, other human beings. If you really believe in the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, that's actually enough motivation for you to enter into this as a Christian. But the fact of the matter is, I think most people, they might think it's a nice thing to say you care about. It will take unbelievable courage to really care about it. But I want to challenge you to really care about it. And here's one of the reasons why, and then I'll wrap up. What if Bible-believing Christians were the people that had the reputation for doing the hard things about race and really living together? And all of a sudden there were communities where people said, hey, they dealt with the wash, rinse, and repeat syndrome. But guess what? The people that are minorities didn't leave. They almost did a few times, but then they all stuck together. And they had breakthroughs, and breakthroughs, and breakthroughs, and breakthroughs, and breakthroughs, because it's going to take a bazillion of them. This is not a sitcom. Something that took hundreds of years to be baked into a society, all right, apart from the most spectacular revival ever, okay, is going to take decades. But you're going to have the courage to lead the way. Because if evangelicals were known for being the people that led the way on race, okay, The word evangelical right now would not be like a ship that's been hit by a couple of torpedoes. People would say, man, those evangelicals, they're doing what everybody else isn't doing. And man, they absolutely love Jesus and the Bible, and they do hard stuff, and I don't know how they do it. And people say, well, they're like, we're not so sure either, but God is giving us courage. God is with us, because otherwise we'd have checked out a long time ago. Because if you get into it, you will want to check out. Because you are absolutely saying, I'm saying goodbye to comfort. I'm embracing discomfort. I'm embracing misunderstanding. I'm embracing frustration. I'm developing dimensions of empathy I never knew that I had. But this is necessary. It's among the things that are necessary for the people of God to really be the people who do that. And here's the thing. Maybe all of you have made that commitment already. You're part of churches where most of the people probably haven't. How are you going to get them on board? How are you going to bring them to take a look at the screen of horror? I'm an optimist. I think you can do it. I want to challenge you to do it. I want to encourage you to do it. You remember what was that line in This Is My Father's World? What was it? The one about... Not that one. Yes, the one about how bad it is. The one about the victory one. Wait. Okay, yeah. Okay, keep going. Wait. Well, can you go to the next one? I think it's... Okay, wait. Okay, all right, it's back. Okay. This is the great thing about live events, right? So... By the way, music is awesome. Let me just say that. And as a bass player, thank you for mixing in the bass. Okay. There it is. Though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. You really believe that? Take courage. Live like you really believe that. And don't run when everything in you says, oh man, I got to get out. I got to check out. No. Don't run away. Run more into it. Not because you got strength, but because God is with you. And if God is with you, and if He is first, if He is the one to whom you have a commitment, and He is alive within you, and you're willing to trust Him, what a public witness we could have. And what a different public reputation Christians would have. And the thing is, friends, we are in a time where people are losing their mind in public life. Okay? They're waiting for somebody to show the way of courage and sanity. How about us?